Okay, welcome everyone. We'll be starting in just a few minutes, right at 8:30, so hang in there. We will be starting soon. Welcome to everyone who's joining us on Facebook Live. We will be starting right promptly at 8:30, so look forward to having this discussion then. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining today. We'll get started in a couple minutes. Yes, and there's a message in the chat. If you have Facebook, because we are live streaming on Facebook, feel free to share the link. I think it'll be a very interesting and important discussion today, so we are excited to get started. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. We'll get started in just a minute. And we will get to questions later on in the panel, so thank you for your questions early on here. I'll just give it a minute or two and then we'll go ahead and start. Okay, I know people will be trickling in, but in the interest of time, we have a lot to get to. So I'm certainly very excited for the panel here today. Thank you so much for joining us for SALDEF's virtual symposium, 20 years post 9/11, Relive, Reflect, React. My name is Gideon Gill, and I'm the Executive Director of SALDEF, the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund. 9/11 was a life-altering time for all Americans. For the Sikh, Muslim, Arab, and Middle Eastern communities, 9/11 was a time of double trauma. First, we felt the tremendous pain that all Americans felt that Tuesday morning for all the lives lost in the horrific attack. Second, we feared for our families, friends, and neighbors due to the backlash that followed. But the story does not end there. We organized and activated community members across the country, and there were local acts of solidarity, compassion, and support. In DC, national AANHPI and MASA organizations retooled to address the challenges that lay ahead. For our symposium today, we'll be focusing on the following topics. Reflect. We will reflect on what organizations did in the aftermath of 9/11 and what organizing looked like pre and post this event. Relive. We will relive the experiences of our community and explore how we collectively raised our voice. Finally, react. We will discuss the lessons learned and answer the question, where do we go from here? But before we proceed into our panel, we have a special message from Congresswoman Judy Chu, Chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. So I will go ahead and play that message now.
Hello, I'm Congressmember Judy Chu, and as the chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, or what we call KPAC, I am honored to be here for this important conversation on the legacy of 9/11. I especially want to thank the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund, or SALDEF, for your leadership, advocating for our communities and for organizing today's briefing. It is so important that we not only remember the lives lost on that terrible day, but also the lessons we learned from the mistakes that followed. And no community understands that better than Sikh Americans. The attacks on September 11th were attacks on our whole nation, and in the days and weeks that followed, many in our country came closer together, united in common cause. But many in the Muslim, Middle Eastern, Arab, Sikh, and South Asian communities were excluded from that unity and instead became subject to an increasing atmosphere of suspicion, xenophobia, and violence. In fact, it was just 4 days after 9/11 when Balbir Singh Sodhi, a Sikh father, husband, and brother, was shot while planting flowers outside his Arizona gas station, becoming the first victim of a post-9/11 hate crime. Sadly, he would not be the last. The focus on terrorism from abroad also became a political justification for more prejudice. Lies about terrorists at the southern border or that all Muslims are dangerous were used to justify cruel immigration policies, Muslim travel bans, and more. What's even worse is that this rhetoric has actually inspired new terrorist threats at home. And sadly, it does not seem like we have learned our lesson because the government is continuing to play a part in stoking xenophobia, this time with China. We know that the more we tell people who to fear, the more people will act on that fear. We saw that happen over the past year and a half with the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes. And let's be clear, anti-Asian hate is not new. The bigotry and xenophobia that many communities, including the Sikh community, experienced after 9/11 was also anti-Asian hate. But those attitudes continue through the present, and in the wake of this global pandemic, anti-Asian hate has become more pervasive with different parts of our community as the target. The more people were told to blame China for the coronavirus, the more Asian Americans, this time primarily East and Southeast Asians, were assaulted or harassed, with over 9,000 anti-Asian hate incidents in the past year alone. Nobody, whether you're Asian, South Asian, Arab, Muslim, Sikh, or any other vulnerable community, should be targeted simply because of their ethnicity or religion. And that is why, as part of the 20th anniversary of 9/11, I joined with Representatives Pramila Jayapal, Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib to introduce a resolution acknowledging the government's role in unjustly targeting people following the September 11th attacks and the role that played in spreading hate, racism, xenophobia, and discrimination. In addition to condemning the racism and prejudice that followed 9/11, this resolution also proposes a number of recommendations to support those affected by this targeting and profiling. This includes creating a new task force to work with community-based organizations to document the impact of these policies and dismantle the ones that are continuing to profile and unfairly target communities. It also calls for congressional hearings to explore this impact and allocates resources to help victims in the Arab, Muslim, Middle Eastern, South Asian, and Sikh communities. And I am proud that this resolution is endorsed by SALDEF and dozens of other community groups. The need to keep our country safe from national security threats remains strong, and I'm proud that there has not been another major terrorist attack in the 20 years since September 11, 2001. But we cannot forget the way our reactions led to the erosion of civil liberties for some and inspired violence in others. We must continue to learn from those mistakes and commit to stopping the fear, division, and prejudice that led us away from our values and even inspired terrorism here. Only then can we truly learn our lessons from the days after 9/11 and ensure that security does not become an excuse to do harm to other communities of color. So thank you again for your leadership today and for inviting me to.
So I think that cut off a little bit at the end, but we certainly thank Congresswoman Judy Chu for all the work that she's done in support of our communities, the AANHPI and MASA communities, and certainly her leadership post 9/11. This picture, actually, I wanted to start off with, I think it's incredibly iconic. So before we jump in the panel and hear some of the incredible stories of organizing pre and post 9/11, I just thought it would set the stage. This is a picture that was taken with a number of AANHPI and MASA organizations. It was organized at the Japanese American Memorial for Patriotism during World War II. I think I have that right. I think David can correct me if I'm wrong. But so many organizations and groups came together in solidarity with specifically the MASA groups, Muslim, Sikh, Arab Americans, and many others, South Asians, that were experiencing hate directed towards our communities in the aftermath of 9/11. So I think a lot of these stories, unfortunately, the broader community, I know certainly a lot of these stories are new to me coming into this organizing space in the last couple of years, but I think they're stories worthy of being told. And I hope we can really share that today and bring that out on this panel and talk about, again, how we move forward. You know, now we're reflecting back 20 years. We do have some incredible panelists today, and I'm so happy that they have joined us. We have from Executive Director of APIA Vote and former Executive Director of OCA, Christine Chen. We have Seema Agnani, who is the Executive Director of National Capacity and formerly Executive Director of Chaya? Yes, okay, so we have a lot of executive directors here on the panel. We have Basim Elkara, who's the Executive Director of CARE out of Sacramento. We have Greg Orton, who is the National Director of NCAPA, the National Council on Asian Pacific Americans. We have David Inoue, who is the executive director of JACL, Japanese American Citizens League. And we have Manjeet Singh, who is the founder of SALDEF and was, certainly very active during 9/11. And that is our first panel. So I think I will go ahead and start it off with Christine, because I know there's a lot to get to in this first panel. Christine, you were actually one of the key organizers in the picture that was shown earlier of that press conference. You were active during the time in your role as executive director of OCA. And I wanted to kind of talk to you to set the stage, if you could set the stage of what the state of AAPI and MASA organizing was like at the time of 9/11, and how did it change post 9/11?
Right. Well, thank you so much. I think this is a great opportunity to always look back and think through and listen to the stories and how it's really applicable to today. Maybe to also level set, I just want to also provide context in terms of what the infrastructure and population was even like back in 2001. Asians at that particular point in time was only 4.2%. The Asian Indian population was maybe a little bit over half of 1%. And really the growth of the South Asian community really happened during that 2000 to 2010 time period, really post 9/11. I always like to remind folks that email was very limited, and really most of our organizing was done by old-fashioned phoning and faxing, and it really was, the importance of relationships. I think for us to come together so quickly, try to identify where the resources were in different components of the federal government, in the community organizing at the national and local level, was because there were pre-existing organizations and relationships. I also want to flag that at this particular point in time, the community was growing, and it was also learning to build its infrastructure and learning to get organized at the federal level around public policy and advocacy organizing. Only 5 years earlier, you pretty much only had JCL, OCA, which at that time was really called Organization Chinese Americans and focusing on Chinese community, Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, also, and lastly, NAPALSI, which is now, it as Asian American Advancing Justice, AJC. And CRAC at that time was only recently shifting their work internationally in regards to refugees to here domestically. At that same time, only 5 years earlier from 9/11, we were also recovering from the 1996 campaign finance controversy, where the Asian community was like suddenly thrown in the limelight. It was really uncharted territories where, for the most part, we've been politically invisible for quite a while, and was just starting to gain political influence through political donations. And the campaign finance controversy was focused on allegedly illegal fundraising and improper influence by select Asian and Asian American donors. So we're heading into 9/11 with the whole thing about fighting the stereotypes of Asians, specifically Chinese, as the perpetual foreigner. And then even leading up to 9/11, my role at OCA, we were already tracking conservative commentaries and hearing about books being published about the next yellow peril and similar themes like that. So when September 11th occurred, all the attention then shifted to a new target: Muslim, Arab, and Sikh and South Asian communities. We also have to remember that that Tuesday was really supposed to be another day in New York politics, where they had the New York City primaries. We were also basking in the idea that Rocky Chin was running for city council, and we had an Asian American running. But obviously, with the events of September 11th, all got shifted. In terms of infrastructure, I would have to give, once again, a lot of credit to the Japanese Americans elected officials. At that time, we had Senator Inoue, who came out forcibly, as well as Congresswoman Patsy Mink, Mike Honda, Robert Matsui. I mean, Patsy Mink specifically raised concerns about the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security. And we know, I'm sure later on in this conversation, we'll be talking a lot about the implications of establishing that and the policies that followed with that. We also had, Secretary of Transportation Norman Mineta using his relationship and close proximity to President Bush to push, especially 6 days later, to making sure that they were condoning racial profiling. But once again, there still a lot more needed to be done. And then, as mentioned in the photograph that was seen a week later, was really the September 11th rally at the Japanese American National Memorial, where we had over 400 diverse communities, federal employees, grassroots organizers, veterans, really calling for solidarity and to end hate-motivated violence. And this backdrop was specifically used to invoke the lessons of history from World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor and the impact on Japanese Americans. At that particular point in time, if you look at the press release that was sent out, OCJCL took the lead in terms of organizing it, but it was really important that we centered the impacted communities up in front and really made sure that we were in the background just doing the legwork to get everyone there and get the press attention. But it's really about the stories that need to be centered. Karen Arasaki really played a pivotal role in terms of really getting the leadership conference on civil and human rights, a lot of the civil rights groups that at that particular point in time had very little relationships with the South Asian and Muslim community. And so it really was a time where, once again, I think the importance of continued infrastructure building and relationship building was really important in terms of getting where we at a week later. And then even in terms of moving forward, I remember resources were then raised to making sure that we were able to support and create space for South Asians to really look at and discover and talk about like, who are South Asians and what type of infrastructure needs to be built. And I think because of that, we've been able to see the successes of a lot of the different South Asian groups that have come from that. And just overall, I was looking up a lot of the documents from that time period, and I found some notes in terms of like 11 best practices in terms of what we need to do to support the South Asian community. And as I was reading this, I was like, a lot of these same lessons of like identifying local South Asian leaders, allocating funds and resources, advocated for disaggregated data. These are the same practices that we've had to like carry and amplify and practice for so many other occasions. So I think what we've seen from how we gathered together in September 11th and moving forward, there's a lot of the same lessons that need just to be practiced, but I think we just need to be deeper and really strengthen all the institutions and the relationships.
Oh, that's an incredibly helpful perspective, Christine. And I think it's really amazing, the work that you did and the organizations that were there that really gave space to a lot of the South Asian, Muslim and Sikh organizations. And you're right, it's certainly the organizing in, I can speak certainly for the Sikh American community is an outgrowth of that. And it's appreciated that our voices were able to be centered at that time when it was most needed. I want to turn it over to you, Seema, because you were, we kind of got a perspective on a national level from Christine. You were organizing locally in New York, Ground Zero. What was that like? And you were organizing specifically with the South Asian community.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's great to hear what was happening nationally at that time. I was working in New York City. Chaya CDC was only a year and a half old at that time. We had formed Chaya at the end of 1999, really to expand the base of an Asian American organization there in New York City, Asian Americans for Equality, that worked in affordable housing and economic justice issues. And so Chaya really started as an affiliate of AANHPI to try to expand its services in the growing South Asian community of New York City. So we were primarily working in the Lower East Side, in Astoria, Queens, Flushing, Queens, where there's a large Bangladeshi community, as well as in Flushing, there was a very large Pakistani, Afghani, and Sikh community as well. And so, when 9/11 happened, to Christine's point, we as a community, we're just building our infrastructure. Chaya was 1.5 staff. We were sharing offices with, so it happened, the Commission on Human Rights. And so that actually ended up being a really important partnership in responding to all that happened on 9/11. And citywide, we had in 2000, there was a conference held called Desi's Organizing, which really brought together leadership from across the South Asian community. We had just started to talk about, okay, what do we really need to do to build a stronger network across the city? So at that time, really the immediate response that was needed, Chaya's phone started ringing off the hook the next day. Of people unfortunately getting fired from their jobs, being evicted from their homes. Of course, hate incidences as well. But really initially, it was really the community was terrified because of course, discrimination against the Muslim community long predated 9/11. And so really a lot of what came together and really fueled that anger led to not only discrimination by individuals, but eventually the state itself, right? I mean, under the Bush administration, the special registration program, as well as the Patriot Act, were eventually put into place. And, if Patriot Act 2 had passed, things would have been much worse for all of us, right? So it started on the individual level and eventually became an institutional level response at that time. So, Chaya's immediate work was really to help address the economic issues that had occurred. A lot of the taxi drivers that were impacted severely economically because downtown was a major hub. You could no longer drive in Manhattan. And so we ended up spending a lot of our time helping cab drivers apply for the FEMA assistance, eventually ended up helping thousands of cab drivers, as well as small business owners who were affected, right? A lot of street vendors had their carts downtown. And so a lot of the same challenges we're seeing today in terms of the pandemic and the economic needs of our community. Those who earn in cash, those who aren't able to document their income as effectively are having a harder time accessing federal relief. And, that is definitely something we're seeing again today, post-pandemic. So there were multiple layers. There was the economic loss, there was the heightened level of fear, and, in terms of and of course, the immigration issues that emerged later. I would say the best thing we did was really build strategic partnerships at that time. Chaya started working closely with the New York Taxi Workers Alliance to, really do the one-on-one services that were needed. We were organizing tenants in buildings that were 80% Bangladeshi at that time, and particularly the Bangladeshi community was extremely vulnerable in that moment because there were more people who didn't necessarily have, came to the US on diversity visas. And so, mixed status families that really were afraid to ask for any help in that moment. And so we ended up, working with the faith-based institutions. Actually, CARE in Queens, we worked very closely with them. They were the frontline people who got food to families, provided shelter to those who didn't have housing. And even the restaurant owners, I would say, in times of crisis, it is the business owners and the faith-based institutions that often step in to really provide what's needed in that immediate moment. Whereas we tried to provide services best we could. The other thing that's worth raising here is, because we were part of the Asian American organization, Chinatown was also, as we know, hit very hard by 9/11. And it was really in that moment that we realized Chaya needed to spin off because we needed leadership, within the South Asian community as well, sort of driving the organization. AFI had so much to confront in Lower Manhattan, while the issues we were dealing with were extremely different. And so we decided really it was time to build out Chaya as a separate entity really at that time as well, and work in partnership with AFI rather than stay within the organization. So, there is an important point there in terms of how we work together, the need for self-determination for each of our communities while also working collectively, I think to address these issues on the national level. I don't want to take up too much more time. I know there are many others that are lined up to speak, but I would say really the partnerships were really the key to finding solutions for our communities, bringing in the legal organizations to do the one-on-one assistance, particularly when programs like the special registration were put into place, and we really needed to defend the rights of people who were facing some serious issues. And the community organized itself citywide. We brought in the New York Immigration Coalition, I remember played a really important role at that time locally, to organize the broader nonprofit sector across the state to really think about how do we coordinate and drive services and support each other through these difficult times. I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, thank you, Seema. And I think you brought out a lot of good points. I mean, one which I think will likely be a common theme here is the partnerships being incredibly important, because no one organization can do everything. And especially at that time when the infrastructure wasn't built out, I think that, certainly was very helpful across the board. And the other thing I think is interesting, you mentioned economic and immigration issues. So a lot of times we do center the civil rights issues, but the community has various needs, which Chaya was addressing, I guess, pre and post, and there was, maybe those were heightened post 9/11. So certainly those are some things that jumped out at me as you spoke. Manjeet, I'll turn it over to you, because SALDEF is a DC-based organization. Started off as SMART, so with more of a media focus. How did SALDEF, the trajectory of SALDEF change pre and post 9/11, and how did SALDEF respond to community needs? Can you maybe take us through that, and especially from being at a national organization based in DC?
Yeah, thank you, Kiran, and it's so good to see so many folks that I haven't seen in a long time, Christine and Natasha and Rajvi. So it's great to be here with all these distinguished panelists. So first, just like you mentioned, and I know Christine was saying, there were a handful of organizations that existed pre 9/11, and SALDEF was one of them. We had been around for 5 years, having established ourselves and started in '96. And at the time of 9/11, we were the only national Sikh organization. We were small, but we were the only Sikh organization. We had a staff of one. We have one full-time employee, and I recall the phone would not stop ringing. It was ringing nonstop 24/7. And that's the way it was for several days after 9/11. And even though as a community, we had been at the receiving end of hate and bigotry and suffering from hate crimes, dating back more than 100 years since our first arrival in the United States in the early 1900s. But 9/11 kind of aggravated that level of ignorance and hatred and bigotry to a level that had never been seen before. And there were so many hate incidents and violent incidents against Sikhs. It was incredible. Just like our Muslim and Arab brothers faced that, we were also at the receiving end of those ignorant, motivated crimes. And our first response was to ensure the safety of the community. And that was the primary objective. And we had a pool of volunteers who kind of came forward to provide that first response. We guided them. I remember having multiple calls in a day to coordinate the response, make sure people knew what were the right messaging, what was the right kind of resources, who to turn to, how to report incidents, how to record the incidents. That was the other challenge we were facing. the volume of the incidents was so large that we were having difficulty just keeping track. And that was an important kind of requirement, because as things were progressing, we wanted to have the data to be able to talk about the level of violence and hatred that we were facing. So that was the primary objective, and then added to that, the second thing that kept immediately followed was the racial profile, which was happening by ordinary Americans on the streets, but it was also happening at airports. I remember this distinctly. It was probably 3 days after 9/11, and got a call from a friend up in Albany, New York. And he said, I'm flying out of the airport here, and they've asked me to remove my turban. They put it through the airport security machine. And that was the first time we'd received a direct call. And then after that, it was nonstop. So Secretary Mineta played a critical role, as Christine mentioned, and was instrumental. He personally was instrumental in having the Department of Transportation put out guidelines. We worked with the EOC and make sure that the airports were aware of the right protocol to follow, and Sikhs were not being subjected to this unfounded and baseless racial profiling. So as a community, we just kind of had to ramp up everything. I mean, it was not only just capacity, but every aspect of what we were doing had to just was being ramped up. The other thing that I want to highlight, which Christine and Seema also mentioned, was the level of support that we were receiving from other communities and other organizations, Asian, Arab, and Muslim organizations, was just incredible. Absolutely incredible. The relationships and the bonds that got established during that period have lasted now 20 plus years later. And that is the hallmark of us as communities coming together for a common challenge and for the common good. That we have seen our organization evolve. We have gone from being a toddler to a young adult now. It's been 25 years. So I look back and I'm proud of what we have accomplished, and I'm proud of all of you who have supported us and supported each other in this journey. And even though we have accomplished a lot, there are new challenges on the horizon, and that's the sad part. But at the same time, we're up for it. We handled it before, and I'm confident we'll be able to handle it and address it for each of our respective communities and collectively in a very meaningful and in a successful way, which makes our American experiment in democracy and the society much better for all of us.
Thank you, Manjeet. And as you talk about the experience of SALDEF and how the focus changed, or there was the immediate needs post 9/11, and I'm sure it was hundreds of calls both on the racial profiling and the hate crimes and hate incidents. You also talked about partnerships, and I know this story has been relayed to me a couple times by different people, especially in the last couple of weeks, about the solidarity that the Japanese American community showed towards the MASA community. So I want to turn it over to David. JACL was one of the organizations that immediately came to the aid of organizations like SALDEF, of the Sikh American community, of the Muslim American community. Obviously, the Japanese American community experienced significant discrimination and backlash during World War II, but JACL was actually founded in 1929. So as I recently learned, so it's the oldest Asian American civil rights organization. Can you share with us a little bit about how Japanese Americans related, and those at JACL related to what they saw unfolding post 9/11?
Sure, thank you, Kieran. And I'll actually start off with my own personal reaction to 9/11. I had actually just moved to Washington, D.C. Just about 2 months prior to 9/11, and was in a new job, 9/11 happened, I basically walked home that day because I didn't want to take chances taking the subway or anything. Get home and start talking to neighbors, basically. And one of my neighbors right away he says, we need to do something about these, and used a slur and said towel heads. And right away, and at that point, we didn't even know who had done this. And people were already jumping to these conclusions that we know who did this, and we want to get them. And that really drove it home for me immediately. Actually, that evening, I sent off a letter to the Washington Post, and first time I ever got published by the Post, actually, with a letter basically saying that we need to learn from the past, from experience with what happened to Japanese Americans, that we don't make these same mistakes again of questioning people's loyalty, essentially just by painting them with a broad brush. As for JCL at the time, and we were really blessed as far as who was in our leadership positions at the time. So at the time we had Floyd Maury, who was our national president, who was elected. John Tateishi was the national director. And at that time, he was based in California. And in Washington, D.C., we had Christine Minami. So as often people knew, the two Christines who kind of led JCL and OCA here in D.C. But it was really the three of them got together right away, and I've had a chance to talk to all of them about this. And it was just sort of the clarity that this is our moment, that our experience has so much relevance to what could possibly happen here, that it's our turn to really stand up, where back in 1941, 1942, no one did stand up for Japanese Americans. So right away, and Christine mobilized here in Washington, D.C. as far as putting things together. There was obviously that press conference that sort of everyone recognizes. Even before that, there was also a candlelight vigil that was held at the memorial as well, a smaller group, but I think just as equally powerful an event, really, to bring people from the APA community together and express their solidarity with the South Asian community and the Muslim community. At the same time, John and Floyd were focused on getting a statement out right away. And I think JCL was probably one of the first national organizations to actually put out a statement speaking out in solidarity. But as I mentioned, and we've been talking a lot about the issue of solidarity, and that's where Japanese Americans really were coming from the experience of what had happened during World War II. That there was a lack of solidarity. None of the mainstream civil rights organizations stood up. And we mentioned earlier before the call that JCL was founded in 1929. We actually cribbed our bylaws from the NAACP. Similarly, others have since kind of cribbed from us. But even NAACP, ACLU, the major labor unions, none of them stood up for Japanese Americans during World War II. It was really the only group that did, the only national group that did stand up were the Quakers, and they're clearly not the lobbying powerhouse here in Washington, D.C. So there was just sort of this sense in the community that, look, we need to make sure that we stand up for others the way no one else did for us. And that was really, I think, what drove a lot of it. I think the other aspect, Christina mentioned email earlier, that was kind of the beginnings of really using email to organize. And in the Japanese American community, we use that in those first few days. Some of the connections I made with other Japanese Americans, just sort of in this sort of shared sense of pain that what was happening, just reaching out, and just email networks just sprung up all of a sudden. And I feel like that was, with 9/11, that really did sort of energize email as a networking tool for many of us in the community, and was invaluable in making those types of connections. So in many ways, this kind of was a catalyst, I guess, for a reawakening of our community, both Japanese American and also making those connections to others. It's kind of like Vincent Chin did back in the 80s, and it seems like these crises sort of are what really do bring us together and make us stronger as a community.
Thank you so much, David. And I'm going to turn it over to Basim because, you know, and we talked about, I know a number of the panelists talked about the experiences, you know, post 9/11 of the MASA communities. You know, Muslim Americans certainly got the brunt of the targeting, not only with hate crimes and hate incidents, but with government surveillance programs and the like. And I know, I believe in our previous discussions, you were organizing in college at the time. Is that correct? So you got your sort of your organizing roots earlier on, and I know I remember we were talking about some of the alliances and partnerships with other community members, the Sikh American community. But can you talk about, for the Muslim American community, what did organizing look like pre and post 9/11?
You know, CARE started in 1994. And CARE's first intern was a dental student who created CareNet and was pretty tech savvy and so early and creative, but it took the community a long time to catch up. And so a fax machine was the way to go. So they would send faxes to all the mosques and organizations around the country. It was Ibrahim Hooper from DC just faxing away, and then folks making announcements at the mosques, and that's how kind of organizing started in the community. And then before 9/11, there were 8 CARE chapters. After 9/11, the community scrambled around the country to try to figure out how to respond, how to, and it was mainly board driven. There weren't much staff at the time, and so the board, people thought they were staff, and they volunteered. They were active in the mosque. They would make announcements, and then years later, when the resources came in, and they started adding staff. But that took quite a bit. And then, you know, as students, a lot of the folks that would eventually come to work for CARE got their start in the MSA, Muslim Student Association, and many of the folks were students during 9/11. And at that time, Muslims played a pivotal role. You had MSA West in California, in the West Coast actually, where they mobilized MSAs throughout California and the West Coast to unite them, to get them to respond. Because many of the first generation just were shell shocked. They didn't know how to respond. They didn't know how to react. And so it was the students that kind of took the lead. But we needed support. And I remember when I was at Cal, CARE, San Francisco Bay Area, did a series of workshops to support students throughout the Bay Area, media training, you name it. And it was really helpful. I mean, looking back, there were amazing trainings that really helped us during a difficult time. Now, you know, as students, we learned how to organize. I mean, we had right after 9/11, the Daily Californian had a cartoon image, and it raised this character of they're trying to show Sam, but it looked like, remember, the Sikh community. So we worked and organized not only with the Sikh community, with the Sikh students, Latino students, API students, and we took over the Daily Cal until about 2 a.m. And we said, we're not leaving until you apologize to our communities. And because we said, if this is happening at Cal, God knows what's happening around the country. This is where this free speech movement was born. So we had to send a strong message that we're not going to tolerate hate in our paper or on our campus. And there was a lot of hate at the Berkeley campus. A lot of right-wing groups were pushing. We had pro-war rallies, and then, you know, we all had to respond. And so it was a very intense period with limited resources. But we forged brotherhood and sisterhood. I mean, you know, folks from the Sikh community, that we have this bond from those days of organizing together and responding to challenges in the Muslim community, to the Sikh community. And it was actually in Northern California, the Sikh community was hit pretty hard. You know, in Sacramento in 2011, Atwal and Singh were murdered in El Grove, California. That shook the community, the entire community. Because no one knew at that time. I mean, no one knew at that time what it was about. Was it that they think they were Muslim, or but we know that many members of the Sikh community were just targeted because of hate. And so that incident, and then there was a cab driver, a Sikh cab driver, who was attacked, and racial slurs were, and there was an arrest made, hate crime charges, hate crime enhancements, and so it was a very, very tense time for our communities. Hate crimes against mosques, gurdwaras, but every time anything happened, it just brought the community closer together. Folks worked closer together, supported each other more and more. And the Sikh community and the API community were very instrumental. They were there with us every step of the way. Every time we had a challenge, they were there. Now, going back to special registration, we were students at the time when that was going on. And we would go and volunteer at the INS building in San Francisco, and groups from ACLU, API organizations, Arab and Muslim organizations were just all there. And I'll never just forget that time, just the bonds we built there as well, where you're signing folks up, getting their information, and then Yemeni Americans walking into that building, some of them coming out, some of them never coming out. And it was just the trauma that it had on so many of us, just seeing, just you're talking to someone, you see the fear on their face here in the United States, and walking to the building, and then that's it. We don't, and there was 80,000 folks were registered, and then 13,000 were put in deportations. I mean, it
Wow.
devastated the community, it devastated families. And so it was a very traumatic time, but we learned a lot from that time, and that was kind of the foundation for the post 9/11 organizing. And now folks have taken kind of to the next level.
Yeah, no, that is definitely devastating for the community. And I mean, it's great that there are other organizations and communities supporting, but wow, those numbers are staggering. I can't even imagine. Greg, I want to turn it over to you to kind of close out our first session of the section of this panel. You were actually, I know you were younger at the actual time of 9/11, but you later on worked on the Hill, and you were there during the 10th you were there during the 10th anniversary of 9/11. At the time you were on the Hill, did you see a lot of fellow API, MASA voices there, whether your peers or organizations? And then also the narratives that we've talked about on this panel in terms of the framing of 9/11, were you able to see that during the anniversary? And if not, why do you think that wasn't the case?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with everybody. And I would say Capitol Hill is an amazing place to work where you will always learn, but it can be incredibly lonely if you're from a community of color. And, at the time when I was there were very, very few Asian Americans, almost no Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, and maybe a handful of South Asian staffers at the time. And, when I think about this question, I have some regret, because I think recently I was asked to reflect on my experiences as a staffer in the context of staff diversity. And I had to point out that current staffers must feel a certain way if they're Asian American, given the racism we've seen with COVID-19. And there's a stronger community today than there was back then. And so I can only imagine what it would have been like to be, a MASA staffer, right? Because everyone's been there where they feel the magnifying glass on their back when they're in the room, when they know the eyes are on them because of just the way they look. And so, I was certainly young back then and learning how to be a good staffer. But as I spent more time, I made it a point to sort of check in with a lot of my colleagues who are coming from the community when 9/11, the anniversary, would roll around, because it was just a recognition that it was probably a tough time to be on the Hill, because the way it was talked about, it was almost this politically untouchable subject where this terrible tragedy did happen, and it was certainly awful, but our ability as a country to expand that narrative just didn't exist, and there was real resistance to even go there. And from a political standpoint, you're always talking about choosing your moments to stand out as an elected official, and nobody wanted to do it in the name of sort of justice and equity for South Asian communities in the country. And so I think it was really a time in which I learned that the institution that I was working in, despite all of its promises, still had a long way to go in terms of really embracing equity in a meaningful way. From a policy perspective, there was the reauthorization of the Patriot Act 2005. I think there was another partial reauthorization in 2012. And then the USA Freedom Act eventually came around. But we all know, when you remix a song, it might sound different, might have a few new things, but it's still the same song at the end of the day. And so that's certainly something that stuck with me when I was on the Hill. So I know we are a little bit over time. I'm happy to answer more questions on it, but I think really what it came down to is there's still a lack of representation, which translates to a lack of diversity of views and conversation when we talk about the anniversary of 9/11 on the Hill.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg. Yeah, so we are running a little over, so I think we'll just jump to our second panel now. And thank you all the panelists for our first panel, and we'll see you back in about 20 minutes. So, so if our panelists for the second panel can come on. All right, wonderful. I think we're just missing Rajbir. Hold on. Oh, there you are. Wonderful. So we have, for our second panel, we have some amazing panelists that can share their stories about their activism in the Sikh community. We have, first we have Natasha Soni, who's an activist and partner at Garcia Hernandez and Soni. And she was active, also working with SALDEF at the time and many other organizations within the Sikh community. Amansira, who was a volunteer and is now a board member of SALDEF. Rajbir Singh, again, a volunteer and now an assistant US attorney. And Gavneet Singh, who started in his, looks like also in college with Basim, who is also doing organizing, volunteering for SALDEF at the same time and is now our board chair. So I will start with you, Rajbir. I know you came on a little bit later with SALDEF formally, but can you talk about your experiences around 9/11 and what inspired you or informed you to go into this career trajectory?
Yeah, so I was a second year in college in Philadelphia at the time, and 9/11 occurred. I was a medical child. My dad was a doctor. My brother was in medical school. I was pre-med and EMT in high school, and still doing EMT work and paramedic work when I was at home and back in Pittsburgh, and was still looking at that trajectory. And 9/11 occurred, and it changed the perspective of what was valuable, what issues were important, and what what I wanted my life to mean. And it was beyond the monetary aspects. It ended up becoming more of a sort of mission driven. And so I got more involved just in political work and community organizing, anti-war work, housing, economic issues in Philadelphia, education issues, but local mentorship programs in the Philadelphia area, and got sort of ingrained in the local community organizing fashion and activities. And when I was, on the day of 9/11, I remember I was sleeping in, and my mom called me and mentioned to turn the TV on and see what was going on. And I couldn't imagine what was happening. My eyes, like everybody else's eyes, were glued to the TV to understand and comprehend or try to what was happening. And the only thing I could think of from my immediate gut reaction was an EMT, because I know there was an initial call, was they needed first responders to help out. And I told my mom, I'm going up to New York. I'll call my ID. It's not a big deal. And we'll figure it out. And her response was, no, don't do it. There was a lot of stories of what was going on in New York. There was a lot of stories about what was happening in other parts of the country to members of the community. And it took a while for me to sort of understand what I should do, what I shouldn't do. And I've still been grappling with whether or not my decision to not go was the right one. And it's a decision I'll still probably grapple with 20 years later. And I think it's a decision I regret, but it was a decision that impacted me and that thought process and consideration was a turning point for me to sort of understand maybe, medicine wasn't the right thing for me. Maybe I need to do more meaningful work for myself and understand where I want to go professionally. And I was offered the opportunity to and follow in Preet Mohan's steps at SALDEF. It was a great experience, a lot of challenges. They had made a lot of relationships, a lot of headway at that time. And at that time, the focus, I think, was to sort of build on a lot of the steps that had been made and the relationships that were developed. And I think we did a lot of that and professionalized, I think, the work. I think the challenge became the Sikh community is still very, we're amateurs in the political game, and we never had to really understand the process, understand community organizing, have a voice in a lot of these issues. And 9/11 was that spark to get people to understand that we're engaging more, not just on our self-determination and our own civil rights issues, but we're engaging more in larger political issues. We're engaging more in social issues. We're getting a part of school boards. We're getting involved in education issues, housing issues, immigration issues, et cetera. So, and that was really an interesting aspect of the work. And then as I sort of helped transition sort of the organization, there was a lot of sort of emphasis on the administrative aspects of national security work and work with the FBI, the ODNI, and engaging in a lot of those nitty-gritty policies that are not really those kinds of policies that you can put in a press release, or you can talk about in the media about but they are the most critical aspects of engaging individuals so that our community is viewed very well. So it's changed my career. I never thought I'd be a prosecutor. I had a lot of friends in DC who told me not to go to law school when I was on my way out of SALDEF. And I'm glad I did not take their advice. When I went to law school, I loved the trial work, and my gut reaction has always been the best defense attorney for a defendant is a good prosecutor. But seeing somebody who has a turban and a beard, who's representing the United States of America in federal district court, has been an honor, and to be able to have that opportunity is consistently an honor, and that's why I am where I am.
Thank you, Rajveer. Well, that's certainly quite a trajectory, but we certainly need lawyers in our community, and certainly at that time as well. Natasha, you were also a lawyer as well. You were a young lawyer during 9/11. You were involved with the community, but I would anticipate pre 9/11, you wouldn't have thought the role that you suddenly sort of jumped into would have been so immediate and so needed. Can you just share what it looked like at that time? I know there was certainly a lot less infrastructure then than there is now.
Thank you, Karen. As a young lawyer, I felt at the time that there were just a handful of us kind of scattered across the country, and being based in California then and now, I felt far away, but this immediate kind of calling and need to help fill a void where there was a lack of infrastructure. I mean, SMART definitely existed and was there and a tremendous resource, but we've since, as you've seen, the community has grown and the infrastructure has grown. tremendously since then. I recall at the time, it was, it was pre-Facebook and pre-Instagram. I think we were still in like the world of Friendster and email. And so email, as someone mentioned on the first panel, like email was suddenly a very intense place of organizing, a community space for organizing. And we somehow found each other. And as Manjeet was mentioning, like one of the key tasks in that moment was to deal with the quantity of hate crimes that were coming in and the information that was coming in. And we had created this rather elaborate Excel document where we were tracking, and amongst the lawyers that had come together, and maybe some law lawyers as well, we assigned to ourselves, or we had a coordinator who was assigning to us certain numbers of cases. So we would call first to verify whether it was just fake information or not, because stories were running rampant, and also to make sure that cases weren't being missed, because there were constantly stories of someone being attacked in one part of the country or another part of the country, and we needed and were trying to provide support in whatever way we could. And so we would track them on this document, and we would put into the document verified, unverified, here's a contact person, here's a family name, here's who's calling, point person. And in that way, I remember working on one case of an auntie in San Diego who was attacked soon after 9/11, and kind of seeing that case through. And I think the other thing that just really has stayed with me from that immediate aftermath was really emphasized in the previous panel around community groups coming together, and definitely calls and support from the Japanese American community. I remember us having original organizing meetings in the basement of the ACLU LA office, and the Asian Pacific American Legal Center providing resource and support, and people just kind of coming together any way they could to figure out what to do, organizing press conferences at the Gurdwara, trying to figure out what was it we were trying to say to the larger community at times. And then of course support from Congresswoman Judy Chu. She was an assembly member at the time, and she was remarkable and has been just a constant ally to the community, I think, to whom we're forever indebted.
Thank you, Natasha. That's definitely some good context. And I can imagine it must have been quite an immense task, dealing with all those, the calls that were coming in and the needs of the community at that time. So as a community member, I certainly appreciate, people like you that stepped in to help out. You were also, we have a lot of lawyers here on this panel, also somebody that's career took a drastic turn, post 9/11. So maybe I know we're running a little short on time, maybe briefly share that story and provide some insight as to what inspired you to get more into activism.
Yeah, sure. And thank you. And it's been a pleasure to listen to everybody else. For me, I was in my first year of law school, and I wasn't really considering law school. I was really focused on going to med school the following year. And I was in my contracts class early in the morning, and about 10 minutes in, the professor says, everybody can go home. And I had no idea why. And I go back to my room and try to go on the internet. The internet's not working at all. My cell phone's not working, and I didn't have a TV. So I just started going down the hallway to people's rooms, like, you got a TV, what's going on? And I found out that 9/11 happened. I had no idea that, things were going to change so much. I was living at Camden, New Jersey at the time. And I remember going out to a pizza place the next day, and I had people yelling in the streets at me, spitting, people were like throwing rocks. Every time I went into an elevator, everybody came out. And I remember the first response from the community was, getting all these calls of road rage against anybody with a turban. So make sure you print out an American flag and put it in your car window. And I was like, man, I got to find a color printer. Was what I was worried about, to make sure I had an American flag in my car. And literally, I was just staying low for a bunch of months, and I just felt like I need to get out of my room. I went nearby to the Cherry Hill Mall, and I was sitting there studying for an exam, and I had a little girl, must have been around 3 years old, who walked probably about 15, 20 feet away from me The mother just started screaming her head off in the middle of the mall, grabs her child, and just runs away. And I was like, this is ridiculous. I'm a kid who was born and raised in New Jersey, and I can't walk outside without something crazy happening. Like every single time I go outside, and I felt like I just needed to do something. So I looked up all the different organizations that there were, and I found SMART. And I just wrote an email to SMART being like, hey, I want to get involved. I need to do something about it. And that kind of changed the trajectory for me, because I decided not to pursue med school, decided to stay in law school. I saw a lot of similarities between issues affecting minorities and hate crimes, as well as those affecting people in poverty. And my entire career focused on people in poverty and minorities, and really changed the direction of my life.
Thank you, Amin. It certainly seems like it. And so I can't imagine you as a doctor now. We will see you as a lawyer, and very glad that you did get involved in SMART and now SALDEF. Kamneet, you've been involved in SALDEF since the beginning. You were first started off as a volunteer. Now you're currently serving on the board. So you've seen sort of this progression in the community. How do you feel that that organizing has evolved? Can you give us some context for that?
Yeah, thank you, Kiran. And let me just first thank you and the staff for really just a brilliant job in organizing this panel. I think it's important that we as a community come together, and again, community capital C. We had our brothers and sisters from across the AAPI community joining us for that first panel. And that was very thoughtful and calculated. We wanted to come to this topic as one community voice. I also realized maybe the second panel, we should have sub-labeled it as kids who thought they would go to med school and didn't. I don't know, Natasha, if you're in that bucket or not, but, and Raj, I want to take credit for you going to law school too, because I remember maybe about 6 months ago, before you left, you and I had, as always, we had an argument every week, right? Not every day. I was like, look, man, when you go to law school, this is going to happen. I remember you sent me literally a 4-letter email. I'm not going to law school. And I have that somewhere, and I'm going to find it and then send it to any judge that you get in front of. But back to the topic here, and I apologize. So I think where we look at the community, and in my kind of life, activism has been really interesting. I was with Bassem on the campus at Cal at 9/11, and we organized the first panel, or the first protest really post 9/11, to ensure that the campus and the administration stood behind minorities. And as I look forward, I think, well, a lot's changed. Natasha, I thought really well spoke about, while there were organizations like SMART and other community groups, or even pods of communities, whether it was in the Bay Area, whether it was in New York, who tried to start documenting, trying to start doing the work. We really saw that gap. I'll juxtapose that though with about 10 years later, 11 years later actually, with the massacre at the Gurdwara in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, August 5th, 2012. And if we look at that, of course, not at the scale of what we saw in 9/11, but if you look at the community's response, dramatically different in how we handled things, how we were able to engage. I think post 9/11, as a community, we probably didn't handle certain things well, and some of it might have just been out of naivete, and some of it maybe was bad form, that we would say things like, oh, well, we're not X. Oh, well, we're Sikhs. They shouldn't be doing this to us. As opposed to, I think, what our history and our tradition would tell us, which is we stand up for everybody who is an innocent and an oppressed person and who is disadvantaged. So any violence against anyone in this country is misguided bigotry and wrong. And I think SALDEF's first press release on September 11th, September 12th said that. And we've stood by that still. And so if you fast forward again, 11 years to Oak Creek, you can see that our community more broadly didn't do that. You saw that we had messaging in place. Oak Creek hit, and SALDEF and other community orgs had spokespeople on the ground, had messaging, had ways to engage with law enforcement, with elected officials, and with policymakers. I think Raj talked about that. He was really at that burgeoning time of where we began to develop a Sikh American political voice, or a policy voice. We were able to leverage that. So I think that's the biggest thing. Ultimately, the community has understood the need to invest in infrastructure and organizations to do this work on a professional level. I think one of the beautiful things that we've learned from our Asian American, or the broader Asian American civil rights community, is post Vincent Chin and post the 90s. I think it was David or Christine that said it, that a lot of the work that was done was by board members and volunteers, right? Board members at that time was really relative. It was folks just rolling up their sleeves and doing work. And I think that's how a lot of the work of the community got done, and realizing that's still critical today, but having professionally staffed and supported organizations is critical. And that's, I think, why we've seen the advancements that we have.
Thank you, Kavneet. I think we can, I think that really is a great segue to the last part of our panel. So if we can maybe have the previous panelists join us. We have quite a group, so maybe I'll start where I did before with Christine. Here we are 20 years later. You were there in the beginning. You saw the organizing, post 9/11. And you saw, obviously you talked about some of the issues that were pre 9/11 for the AAPI community. Where do you think we are now in terms of developing the infrastructure, raising our voice collectively? And where do you think we need to go? What are the steps, or what are the things that we need to do as a broader AANHPI and MASA community?
We definitely have a lot more organizations involved and a lot more infrastructure. But at the same time, I think, and we cover a lot of issues, but I think all of the organizations, we need the volunteers and board members to help really build up the capacity of each of these organizations. So that way we could actually dig deeper and really continue to be the experts and really be able to do the work in a deeper manner. And that really goes back to the recommitment in terms of getting everyone either to donate time or donate dollars, right, for the organizations. At the same time, I will say the reason why I shifted to voting is because that's one area where I've seen us consistently underperform. 2020, we were able to reverse that trend, but the question is, can we sustain that in this year's local elections as well as 2022 and moving forward, right? Because it really is a cycle. Like for us, it's a preparation for us to making sure that during these times when we are not in a crisis, or as much as in a crisis, I should say, are we building that capacity? Are we making sure that everyone that is eligible is registered and voting, so that way when we need it and we have to be able to have a stronger political voice, that we have that already established, right? And so I think that's one of the asks that I would have, is that really to recommit, either to dig deeper in terms of supporting these organizations as a volunteer or to give money, but at the same time for those who are eligible, to making sure that you're registered and you're voting on a regular basis, and that you use that time right after the elections to re-engage, to uplift the issues that are important to the community with those elected officials and hold them accountable.
Thank you, Christine. That's definitely a good point. And that's one way we can certainly raise our voice, either electing those officials or getting members of our community in those positions as well. Kavneet, did you want to chime in here?
Yeah, Christine, great point. And I think your point of moving to API vote and voting issues, I think that's actually really point for the entire broader Pan-Asian civil rights community as a whole, of, hey, there are these core issues that we talk about, and we're beginning to see evolution and expansion there, whether it's the technology work that Greg and NCAP are doing, or OCA, whether it's different policy issues that SALDEF and JCL are taking on. How do we begin to interject our voice into broader conversations? And I think one example from that has been the Black Lives Matter movement last year. David, Gideon, Christine, Greg, you were all voices and trying to show how the support from the broader Asian American community for our Black and brothers and sisters. And I think similarly, whether it's now anti-Asian hate, whether immigration, obviously we have an election coming up now, and how do we begin to mobilize and make sure that the issues that are important to us are taken seriously? And so I see that as a really, I think, poignant way for an evolution of our movement. If we think back to Chin's murder in 1982, to then kind of rises in hate crimes in the 70s, 80s, and 90s against the MASA communities, to 9/11 and beyond, perhaps that's the way we really fulfill our missions. And whether it's our organizational missions or our community missions from the Sikh standpoint of standing up for those, regardless of where they are on the spectrum.
Thank you, Kavneet. I'm going to ask Basim, from the Muslim community perspective, what are your thoughts in terms of, it sounds like there was a lot of infrastructure built post 9/11, but where do you feel like things are now in terms of the needs of your community?
We're a lot further than we were before 9/11 or post 9/11. But, right now we're taking to the next step where you're seeing folks start 501c4s, trying to build power, trying to actually organize. And so I think we've seen the community have a vision now to where they want to see the community in the next decade. And folks are coming together. There's more unity, and folks are working closer together. Allies, working with our allies, getting support. And I think it really comes down to resources. And I think now, I was by myself for the first 5 years, and just a board that was very hands-on, very supportive. And then, now, we're expanding offices, we're expanding throughout our region. And so, but that wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for our allies, and especially for our allies in the API community. Because if you look at the foundations that were led by folks from the API community, they came through big time to get us more resources, to hire more attorneys, to build out our Immigrant Rights Center. And so we couldn't do this work on our own. We couldn't have taken care to where it is today if it wasn't for our allies who were, if they were chatting with the foundation, they're like, hey, check out what CARE's doing. They're helping out right now the Afghan refugees. They got immigrant rights centers. And so all of a sudden we're getting calls for foundations because our allies are putting out the word that, hey, we're doing this type of work. So I think we've come a long way. There's still a way to go. But I see the trajectory where you're seeing the 501c4s and folks impacting elections at a much more strategic way. And we've always, like in California, if you micro-target the Muslim, Sikh, and Hmong community, you can sway so many elections in the state of California. And yet we've been, and I'm also, aside from CARE, I've been involved in politics and telling folks that, look, it's easy to get the surnames, especially in the Sikh community and the Hmong community and the Muslim community, and you just run it through lists and just have folks from that community go and target that community. And it makes such a huge difference. And I see with my own eyes where many elections, whether it's for assembly, whether it's for school board, we're talking about a few hundred votes. And so, but you have to educate the community that your vote does matter, your vote does count. And so then they get more excited. And so I think in terms of politics, just the way the communities have been coming together and mobilizing and organizing together, the Jakara movement and other folks out there that are saying, we're going to make a difference. We're going to phone bank, we're going to canvas, we're going to make sure that our voice is heard out there. And that's really just gives us hope in the future that we're going to make a bigger difference than we've done in the past.
Oh, absolutely, you're right. I think representation, having our voices be at those those tables and those places where decisions are made are certainly, I think we would have seen a lot different outcome and policies if our voices had been there around the time of 9/11 in those spaces. We do have a question in the chat, so I'm gonna address this to any of the Sikh American panelists. It says, given what the East Asian communities are facing in this new version of hate and violence, what are key lessons you can share? So I guess Gurneet, Manjeet, Natasha, Rajbir, or Amin, if anybody wants to jump in, feel free.
I don't know that there's much that we can share. I think we shared our solidarity with them, and the community is organized. Right? You look at the remarkable way the East Asian community has come together around whether it's Stop Asian Hate, whether it's data documentation. Manjeet, I think, talked about that. If we look 20 years ago, we didn't have a great structure for that. Now there's tremendous data calculation, directly engaging with policy makers, with elected officials. And I think Christine put it beautifully about people volunteering, but also people putting money into play. And you're seeing folks donating to support efforts that will educate against hate, that will document hate. And that's, I think, remarkable progress from where we look at where the communities were 10, 20, 30 years ago.
And I'll add on to that as well. It's like, so just for me personally, like part of that story and the reason why I continue to volunteer with SALDEF was because I got to see all those partnerships and the partnerships being made with so many different organizations. And hearing that first panel speak, a big part of it was the coalitions of so many different groups coming together. And I think now when we respond to these issues and this new version of hate and violence, that coalition and that partnership is bigger and stronger, and our voice is going to be bigger and stronger. And I think that we get to make a bigger impact because we're being heard more. And it's great to see so many different groups here on this symposium as well. And you kind of see that strength right now.
If I could also add one thing, Karen, I think it's really interesting to have these two questions around infrastructure and Asian hate crimes kind of juxtaposed, because while we as the Sikh community learned our lessons from the Japanese American community and the killing of Vincent Chin, upon which we built, and now we're seeing again an increase in hate violence. And this is when we have so much infrastructure. We have more disaggregated data. We have hate crime bills. We have hate crime legislation. We have rapid response networks that are ready. We have victim assistance programs, things that, at least in the Sikh community, we were still learning and building. But the fact, I think, that we are still here, that Asian hate is hitting these. And if you look at SALT's reports on hate crimes year after year after year, you see, like, yes, we might be moving, maybe we're moving the dial in some ways, and we've built so much infrastructure, but that hate is still here and in some ways stronger than it has been before. And I think what that reminds me is, as a Sikh, in our pursuit of justice, our liberties are intertwined in a way that until Black men and until Black women can walk on these streets safely, none of us will. And so it really, I'm an optimist by nature, but you can't help in these moments of reflection, of thinking about how, despite all we have built, how much more we have yet to do. And clearly we can only do it together.
Go ahead, sorry.
I just wanted to add, the other aspect about this is also building the capacity of those of us in communities that are not on the coasts or in big cities. I'm no longer in Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York, Washington. I'm in Kentucky. That's where I live. That's where my family is. That's where my two daughters are being raised. And so seeing myself and other members of my community here in what many people would view as sort of a backward state, but representing ourselves well and playing a role in our communities is important. But then it's also having the support of other individuals in larger cities, organizations. That organizational structure and support needs to sort of develop. And I think as the capacity develops for these communities and for our communities, as that capacity develops, it will develop slowly, unfortunately, but it will develop.
I think you muted yourself, Rajbir. Yep.
I apologize.
Okay.
It will develop over the course of time. But I think that's really where I think we need to start sort of transitioning as a community. We've done a great job in a lot of areas of the country and a lot of high population communities But there are a lot of communities, members of the community in Alabama and Mississippi and Kentucky and Tennessee and in Idaho, in South Dakota, in the Dakotas, that need the same kind of support. And I don't think we're there yet, but I think I think we're getting to that point where we're starting to develop that capacity. And I think it'll be, as our community gets more professionalized and understands the value of active members of the community in all areas of the country, the better I think our community will be in the work that we're doing.
Thank you, Rajveer. I'll turn it over to Greg, since you lead AANHPI, and I think you certainly have a sense of the infrastructure that's in place now, and through AANHPI members where you think we should go. So I'd love to hear from you what your thoughts are on
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have a ton of revelatory remarks to add. I think everybody's really been on point about power building, about playing the policy game, about engaging our communities, and certainly supporting these kinds of organizations. But I think really for me, it's about taking care of ourselves, right? Like it's always going to be a grind, right? Like the system is designed to make this very difficult for us to affect the kind of change we want to see, to Natasha's point. And we have to remember that, it's going to take time and it's going to continue to be a challenge. But if not us, then who, right? Like if we burn ourselves out, we exit the space, we decide we're not able to engage the way we are currently, then who, right? And I think in many ways, all of my panelists, all the people here today, the fact that you're spending time with us at 10 p.m. on the East Coast, if you're out there, shows that you're down, right? And I think that's really important. And so how do we remind ourselves to take that time to be with family, to be with community and friends, to recharge and get ourselves ready for the next round of this fight is really important. And so I am personally genuinely very excited about where the community is headed. I've seen solidarity in ways that really do encourage me that we're on the right track. I've seen a bunch of young people, younger than me, coming up who get this stuff, who are fired up and ready to do the work. And I think it's about how do we continue to cultivate that talent, and how do we continue to build that space where we can come together as a big kind of sometimes dysfunctional family, but ultimately we can kind of rise to the occasion. So yeah.
No, I think that's great, Greg. And I know we're coming up on time. I think there was one question in the chat about organizing for around legal associations and Jakarta, which is another Sikh organization, and high schoolers across the country. But certainly, SALDEF partners with a number of organizations, and I think having that next generation is important to get them involved in the fight, as Greg, as you mentioned. And I think what we really see, as we're coming to the conclusion of this webinar, is we were and in some ways still are to a certain extent in a firefighting mode, in a crisis response mode. And I think it's important that we think strategically about how we can build the infrastructure, whether it be through representation, civic engagement, and other issues that our community has, to build the infrastructure so we can get beyond that. And I think certainly infrastructure and organizations, I know Christine, you mentioned funds and volunteers. That's incredibly important for, I think, all of the organizations that are represented on this panel. And I think, certainly, because in many ways, our organizations are liaisons to the community for a lot of these issues. And it's important that we're in both spaces, right? In the spaces where policy decisions are being made, but also in the spaces where we're hearing directly from community members and really understanding the issues that they're seeing on the ground. So maybe I will give, Manjeet, would you like the last word? We have, I think it's right on 10 o'clock, and I know it's late in the East Coast. So if you would like to say anything, I'll let you have the last word.
Wow. Thank you. I think all I would, kind of summarize and echo the comments made by some of the other panelists in the last several minutes here. I think, yes, there are challenges. Some of them are the same. Some of them are new. At the same time, like Natasha said, we're optimistic. I'm a perpetual optimist, and I strongly believe and I'm confident that we are able to rise to the challenge, not only individually within our communities and our organizations, but collectively, because of the strong bonds and collaborative partnerships we have established, that we can definitely overcome this next set of challenges. And I wish everybody the best, and continue that we collaborate and work as one single unit to fight and overcome these challenges.
Thank you. I think those are great words to end on. And thank you, everybody. Thank you to all the panelists. We have a lot. My whole screen is full of squares. Thank you for your time today, for being here till quite late on the East Coast. Thank you for everyone who joined us across the country. And we certainly appreciate your time today. And I think this is a conversation that certainly should be a continuing one. So I look forward to more discussions with all of you, and discussions with others as well moving forward. So have a great night, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Good night.